Hello, everyone, and welcome to Jane Austen and Company. We're going to wait a minute or two to get everybody in. And while we're doing that, please tell us where you're joining us from.
We're all spread about as well. I'm in balmy Chapel Hill, North Carolina right now.
I am joining from Western Pennsylvania, Seton Hill University, just outside of Pittsburgh.
And I'm in Cleveland, Mississippi, in the Mississippi Delta. Also kind of balmy at the moment.
Ariane is not too far away. Maria. And Nadea, you didn't say where you are.
Oh, I didn't. I'm also in Chapel Hill. So. Yeah, very dark too. Getting dark so early now.
Congratulations, Sarah. That's pretty exciting.
Oh, yes.
And aloha to Kailua, Hawaii. Should we give it another minute or so?
Can you tell how many people are in the queue, Nadea?
Yeah, we've got 55 people with us right now.
No, but can you tell how many people are waiting to get in? Or
I don't think anyone should be waiting.
Okay, good.
Yeah, everyone's able to get in.
All right.
Pretty easy. No hoops to jump through.
Good to know. Okay, well, why don't we begin? Good evening, everyone. My name is Susan Allen Ford, and I'm joined tonight by my fellow hosts, Inga Brody and Sarah Marsh. Our technical director for this series is Nadea Pugh. Going back to 2019, Jane Austen and Company has aimed to provide top-notch programming related to Jane Austen. Jane Austen and Company started as in-person events at local libraries, but since the pandemic, our programs have been delivered primarily through virtual formats. Tonight, we're continuing our series on Austen and the Brontes, which we began earlier this year, and it will continue through the end of January. Yes. So that's your cue, Inga.
All right. We've had 2 excellent events this past month, including a talk on missionary marriages by Dr. Jade Werner and on grief and sisterhood with Claire O'Callaghan. And in case you're not aware, these Jane Austen and Company events are part of a larger organization. We actually used to call the whole organization Jane Austen Summer Program, but that's gotten a little confusing since the summer program is only one of the things that we do. So Nadea, do you have the new logo for us? So our new, we have a new logo for what we're calling Jane Austen Collaborative. And the Jane Austen Collaborative is what runs the Jane Austen and Company. We run the 4-day Jane Austen Summer Program, which is in person always. And we run the Jane Austen for Teachers with our teacher pedagogy events, and Jane Austen's Desk, our new NEH funded fun website. So I think Nadea will show us one of the versions of the new logo.
Yeah, I think I pulled up the wrong slides just now, but I can show everybody
after the talk.
Logo.
We'll show you after the talk. Okay.
So we'll bring that in afterwards. Please visit our website to get more information about the entire slate of speakers for this series, our website is janeaustenandco.org. And our next event on December 3rd will feature Dr. Maria Frawley, professor of English at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. She has published widely on 19th century women writers, including 2 recent essays on life writing in relation to the fiction of both Anne Brontë and Charlotte Brontë. Additionally, Dr. Frawley is the co-editor of the Routledge Companion to Jane Austen. She is currently at work on a book for Bloomsbury Publishing on key words of Jane Austen fiction. What they talk about when they talk about self will uncover the differing understanding of the self that underpins their conception of the individual and why these differences signal more than, say, disparate approaches to narrative technique.
This program tonight was made possible by the North Carolina Humanities, a statewide nonprofit and the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities that connects North Carolinians with cultural experiences that spur dialogue, deepen human connections, and inspire community.
And now, I'm excited to introduce tonight's speaker, Deb Barnum, who many of you may know. Is a good friend. She's a former law librarian, the owner of Bygone Books, an online shop of collectible books. She co-founded the JASNA-Vermont Region and is currently the advisory chair for the South Carolina region of the Jane Austen Society of North America. She authors the Jane Austen in Vermont blog. She's on the board and has been for a long time for the North American Friends of Chawton House. She works with Peter Sabor on his Reading with Austen project, has compiled the Jane Austen Bibliography for 2007 to 2019 for JASNA's Persuasions-Online, and the Burney Year in Studies for the Burney Journal from 2010 to the present. I don't think we haven't mentioned also your work with the Lost Sheep of Godmersham. But Deb has given talks on collecting and illustrating Jane Austen at several Jane Austen at JASNA AGMs, regional meetings, and the OLLI program at USCB, as well as talks on Jane Austen's London and travel in Sense and Sensibility.
Before Deb begins her talk, which should last about 45 minutes, our technical director, Nadea, will explain how you can send in questions during and after the performance.
Thanks so much for that tiny little introduction, Sarah. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the stream. We're very excited to have you here. If you're new and you don't already know, you can leave comments and questions in the sidebar, and our speaker can answer those questions in the Q&A after the presentation. You do need a YouTube or Google account to post in that sidebar, but if you don't have one, that's okay as well. And you can just email your questions to info@janeaustenandco.org. And we'll collect those comments and questions there as well. And we'll post those in the chat for you. So please comment and email. Our speakers love to hear from you. And it makes the conversation more lively.
And now, without further ado, we present Deb Barnum with Illustrating Jane Eyre with a little bit on Austen.
Okay, thank you all. Nadea, would you put up that in the chat, the link to the handout? Hello? Nadea? Are you going to put up the presentation? Oh, thanks. Okay, excellent. Thank you. So there's a handout in the comments that you can, it's just a list of all the illustrators I'm going to talk about and the publication dates of the books. And it would help if you had that as I go through this. So I want to first start by saying that I am not going to talk about book covers, 2 of which you see here, or graphic novels, or board books. A lecture in itself with all the variety. Most of us probably remember our own very first paperback copies of Jane Eyre, and these were mine from 1962, which obviously dates me. A few other caveats. I have given talks on illustrating Jane Austen, and I have most of her illustrated editions in my own collection. And while Jane Eyre has always been my favorite book, and unlike Wuthering Heights, rereads only increased my appreciation, I actually own very few copies of this book. So I've had to rely on sleuthing the internet, and I'm most especially indebted to the website Jane Eyre Illustrated. And though incomplete, it is a treasure trove of images. With many illustrators, this short talk does not cover. The negative for me has not been to fully interact with the book as a physical object, the text and the illustrations, which is, as you will see, the point of the whole visual reading experience. So now on to a little bit of Austen and a whole lot of Brontë. When we think of book illustration, we recall our own favorite books from childhood, where text and pictures are one, as in Kate Greenaway and Apple Pie, or Beatrix Potter and Peter Rabbit, John Tenniel's drawings for Alice in Wonderland. Later on, the adventurous images of N.C. Wyeth, here just his Robinson Crusoe, but he did many. And my favorite, Jessie Wilcox Smith, and this is her Fairy Tales. These illustrators brought the story to life, making the descriptive visual. And as our visual memory is more powerful than our reading memory, these remain indelible in our minds. Just recall how well we remember scenes from the movies. We know of Austen's love and appreciation of art, her letters telling of visiting various London exhibits. We also know that she carried images of many of her characters in her head, though to us, the reader, she gives scant description. In an 1813 letter, she writes to her sister of finding Mrs. Bingley. Exactly herself, size, shape, features, and sweetness. There never was a greater likeness. She is dressed in a white gown with green ornaments, which convinces me of what I've always supposed, that green was a favorite color with her. Scholars have scouted out this portrait of a lady to be the exact one Austen was looking at. Austen later laments there was nothing to be found of Mrs. Darcy. I can only imagine that Mr. D prizes any picture of her too much to like it should be exposed to the public eye. We often forget that Austen's first illustrator was her sister Cassandra, for royal renderings in the Juvenilia piece, The History of England, by a partial, prejudiced, and ignorant historian. You can view the whole text online at the British Library. Well, not right now because of their hacking nightmare. I do think it's on Internet Archive, so you can look at it there. Some of these drawings may have represented Austen family members, these two the most telling. Here's Mrs. Austen as Elizabeth I, and who we all know that Austen hated. Also looks like Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Jane herself is probably Mary, Queen of Scots. But the first Austen novel to be illustrated at all was the 1821 French edition of Persuasions, La Famille Elliot, also the first edition to carry her name, Miss Jane Austen. This is the frontispiece. Austen, of course, knew nothing of this edition as 1821. But the frontispiece has Captain Wentworth removing Walter Musgrove from Anne's back. The volume 2 frontispiece as the famous letter Captain Wentworth is leaving. The first English editions of Richard Bentley from 1833, he had purchased the copyrights from Cassandra. They offered frontispieces and title page vignettes only, all clearly of the Victorian period, and so very wrong. Here is Northanger Abbey and Persuasion, published together in 4 volumes. The frontispiece from Northanger Abbey, where Henry's coming up the stairs to surprise Catherine, and the title page from Persuasion with Anne overhearing the captain. But it was not until 1875 that the first Austen title was published in England with more than just a frontispiece. This is Mansfield Park, published by Groomsbridge in 1875, had 7 purplish gray illustrations by A.F. Leyden, all rather dark and menacing and Victorian, with clearly the fashions of 1875, not 1814, and none of the other novels were done. And this image seems more like this image of Ferndean Manor in the 1872 Jane Eyre, illustrated by E.L. Wimperis. I think they're very similar. But before we get into the many illustrators who took on Jane Eyre, let's start with a few questions about the illustration of books. 6 easy questions. Joan Hassel, a noted illustrator of Jane Austen for the Folio Society, here is the title page for Emma. She writes that the artist must feel passionately about the book being illustrated. And in a sense, each one of us is our own illustrator when we read a much-loved book, and why we react so strongly to how an illustrator or a film adaptation presents how characters look. So let's think about Jane Eyre as though you were the commissioned illustrator, or at least a knowledgeable critic. And here are the 6 questions. So I will be naming various illustrators just by last name, and that is why your handout, you can refer to that to follow along. So question 1, what would you choose to illustrate? The settings, characters, and scenes. So with settings, you have architecture and landscape. Here you have the Red Room, and Fonesca does a landscape. So is the detail in the text, and what is the atmosphere conveyed by the image? Then there are the characters. Here we have Jane, and here we have a Rochester. Are they individualized or idealized? And how defined are their features? The Wilson we don't see her face, which is often more effective. Then we have scenes of the plot, such as Rochester encountering Jane for the first time. And this is the most important question, and what I will discuss for the rest of my talk when I've finished the other questions. In making a list of what I would like to illustrate in Jane Eyre, at least my list reaches at least 100. So question 2, how strictly do you adhere to the text? It has been written that Hugh Thompson famously allowed himself a latitude when occasion seemed to require it. A fine example of this is in Austen's last sentence in chapter 2 of Emma. There was a strange rumor in Highbury of all the little Perrys being seen with a slice of Mrs. Weston's wedding cake in their hands, but Mr. Woodhouse would never believe it. Here, Thompson gives us this delightful, pure comedy of this very easily overlooked sentence. In Brontë, we find this of Rochester and Blanche riding out by Helen Sewell. It is not often illustrated. So question 3, do the illustrations advance the plot, foreshadow the plot, give away the plot, or interrupt your reading? The frontispiece or title page is most often guilty of giving away the plot. Here we have Mr. Rochester on his horse on the title page. You have a good deal of reading before that horse shows up. And who is that with him? Does such a scene ever even happen in the novel? Do the illustrations help the plot? Are the images mere visualization, just mirroring the text? Or are they just decoration? Or do you actually enhance the story for you? Is character revealed? Are your emotions engaged? This happens when imagining Bertha. Does the illustrator make her very real, like Dulac, who has her lunging at Rochester? Or in Gabain, where she is not fully visible at all? Oler, where Bertha is barely visible, you just see a shadow of her. Or Sewell, she's visible, but she's in the middle of a fairy tale about a hulking giant. It just doesn't quite work for me. Or do you make Bertha downright scary? So you have this of Levinson and Eichenberg, very claustrophobic. So question 4, do the illustrations give a true account of the times and setting of the story? Again, this is the Persuasion. showing you how the fashions are not the time of persuasion. So published in 1847, Jane Eyre is actually set in the Regency period, roughly 1810 to 1820, though Brontë herself is inconsistent in her dating. But most all of the illustrators put her in the Victorian period, not as glaring as that with Austen's Persuasion scene here, because we think of Jane Eyre from that period. But just to look at a few paperback covers gives you a sense of the importance of the dating. This one from Jane Eyre from the 1950s, and this from Persuasion, complete with Rex Harrison and Sophia Loren. They just don't actually tell the story that there is in the book, do they? So question 5, what of the illustration is the technique right for the action? I will not be discussing the details of the artistic techniques, pen and ink, watercolors, lithographs, engravings, etchings, or woodblocks or wood engravings. And I am not talking about the other decisions to be made in the creation of the book. The paper, the typeface, and the binding, all to create a nice Jane Eyre. I knew I would do that. Jane Eyre package. But what gets decided is between the publisher and the artist. Most artists excelling at a particular form. So which process and how many images and where are they placed? And do you add decorations and ornaments? Are they color or black and white or a combination of both? And are they full page or just text illustrations? Here is a page from William Morris, who was the master of filling the page with decoration. And here is the cover of Hugh Thompson's 1894 Pride and Prejudice. The man went overboard with more than 160 illustrations and many decorations. And this was after he told the publisher that he didn't find anything at all in Pride and Prejudice that he could illustrate. So just a quick comparison of just 3 different techniques that we'll see in a scene from Jane Eyre. So here's a line drawing, Carl Pemble, and we have Jane and her Aunt Reed. Here's the watercolor. This is Monroe Orr from 1921, Jane and Rochester. Or a wood engraving, and this is Simon Brett, and this is Jane at Morehouse. So those are just a few examples that we'll see. So you'll also see with these examples the view the illustrator has taken with the book. Who is the audience? Is it a love story? Is it a children's book of a young girl discovering herself? Is it a biblical story? Is it a Gothic story? Or is it a really scary Gothic story? So keep these in mind as we go through some of the different illustrators, because they would have been presented their idea about the book in their illustrations. So our final question is, does the illustration that does not agree with your subjective view ruin the reading of the book? And also this applies to the movies. As you see here, various incarnations of Jane Eyre on screen. And which of these works best for you? Who is the best Rochester? And who is the best Jane? You can comment on this in the comments because I'd love to know. And one big question is, do you like your Captain Wentworth being Rochester? So I return to Jane Hassel again. She tells of a 1908 set of Austen's novels that were illustrated by A. Wallace Mills. She found the images so distasteful that she cut out all the 50 colored plates from the 10 volumes. This is a huge mistake from a book collecting valuation point of view. David Gilson, in his Austen Bibliography, calls them insipid. These are very strong responses. I think they look very much like these from M.V. Wheelhouse from 1911 in Jane Eyre. And M.V. Wheelhouse is Mary Wheelhouse, so a woman illustrator. And there aren't a whole lot of them. So I don't think they're that bad at all. But again, that's a personal response. I admit to having a very strong response to the rather famous illustrations by Paula Rago. Here, they're all on the postal stamps that came out from the Royal Mail, but they depress me no end. So the illustrations just don't work for me. Jackie Oakley, in her illustrations of all of Austen's novels, chooses not to represent the faces of any of the characters. So we have this of Mr. Knightley and this of Anne Elliot on the right at Lyme Regis. So does it work better to not have a character drawn too specifically? Because you can have too beautiful a Jane Eyre and too handsome a Rochester. This is the soap opera version of Jane Eyre. Or you could have a too thin Rochester, and I do believe this is the only one with him wearing an eye patch. Or you have a Rochester that I think is way too old. So let's talk about illustrating Jane Eyre. It is one of the most oft illustrated texts in the English language, just as it has nearly the most adaptations, films for movies and television, plays, and radio shows. I can only in this short talk touch on a select few. So I have chosen those that were the earliest, those with different techniques, a few of the more contemporary, and I confess just those I really like myself. Simon Cook, the scholar who has written much on Victorian illustration, asks why the Brontes were the least illustrated of Victorian writers in their own time, but the most illustrated in the modern period. He believes that the illustrators of the Brontes' time were unequal to the task of visualizing the texts. It was only in the modern period that artists, equipped with a visual language of expressive distortion, were able to find pictorial equivalents to match and interpret the writer's challenging explorations of psychology, sexuality, love, and relationships. Much to my disappointment, and you will see that there are only a few Bronte illustrators who did Jane Austen as well. So we first have Edmund Garrett, an American artist and illustrator. He had done only frontispieces for the 1892 12-volume Roberts Brothers edition of Austen's novels. But he was the first to render both characters and scenes for Jane Eyre. It was published in 1890, but unattributed. It was published again in 1897. So here you see a frontispiece to Emma, and on the right, you see Jane meeting Helen for the first time. I do want you to pay attention to the number of illustrators I mentioned that are named Edmund. So my favorite Austen illustrator is Chris Hammond, Christiana. This is a scene from Pride and Prejudice, and that is her Mr. Darcy. She illustrated in her too short life. Like Jane, she died at the age of 41. But she did a number of 19th century novels, 3 Austens, Thackeray, Edgeworth, Gaskell, and more. And she did not do Jane Eyre. And I remain perennially disappointed not to see her Rochester. Here is her Mr. Knightley. He's working on his gaiters in that famous scene. It's one of my favorite clue scenes in Emma. So Hugh Thompson, everyone's favorite Austen illustrator, also did a number of Victorian novelists, even creating the Cranford School of rather sentimental illustration based on his Gaskell work, but no Jane Eyre. The Brock brothers, we have Charles Edmund and Henry Matthew. They made Austen famous all over again in the 1890s by perfecting the Regency period's fashions and interiors in their colorful watercolors and lithographs. Here we have Mr. Knightley on his horse in Emma, and Captain Wentworth again with the infamous letter. But Charles Brock only did 3 images of Jane and Rochester in the book A Day with Charlotte Brontë by Maurice Clare. And here is a rather, for me, too old Rochester. Helen Sewell illustrated Sense and Sensibility in 1957. Here is Mary Ann pining over Willoughby's last letter. But she did Jane Eyre in 1938, and here are 2 images. So a very different illustration. It's almost that you wouldn't think it was the same illustrator. But Sewell also illustrated the 1938 book, The Young Brontes by Mary Louise Jardine. And here we have Charlotte, Emily, Anne, and Branwell, their favorite place on the moor. So again, a very different illustration from this to these line drawings she did for this book. I mentioned Joan Hassel above, who is noted for her wood engravings. I always thought her dark and rather haunting renditions for the Folio Society Jane Austen better suited to a Brontë novel, but she does not illustrate Jane Eyre. She does work on the lives of the Brontës for Margaret Lane's The Brontë Story, and you compare this image of Haworth, and if any of you have been there, this is exactly as it looks. So it's a perfect rendition. But you can compare it to her street scene of Ford's in Emma, so very similar. But I do want to give Hassel her due. I've always thought that Austen wrote her own Brontë-esque scene in Sense and Sensibility. When Eleanor rushes down the stairs expecting her mother and Colonel Brandon, it is a breathless passage. The clock struck 8, the flaring lamps of a carriage. Never in her life had Eleanor found it so difficult to be calm. All that remained to be done was to be speedy. She hurried downstairs, the bustle in the vestibule as she passed along an inner lobby. She rushed forwards towards the drawing room. She entered it and saw only Willoughby. End of chapter. Next chapter begins. Eleanor staring back with a look of horror at the sight of him. That, to me, is a Brontë scene. And this is how Hassel illustrates it. And so doesn't this belong in a Brontë? Totally unrelated, but any talk on illustration must include an Edmund Gorey. So here is his take on the Brontë sisters. No Branwell in sight. And they're quite gory as this is from the book Instant Lives by Howard Moss. It's quite a funny rendition of various authors. So Charlotte Brontë was quite a talented watercolor artist in her own right. Think of her description of Jane Eyre's watercolors as Rochester analyzes them. Dame Darcy, with Johnny Depp on a good day, is Rochester. But Jane's paintings are full of dreamlike images from the world of Bible and myth. But for the 3rd edition, her publisher asked her to do her own illustrations. Remember, this was the time of the height of Victorian illustration, when most novels were published serially in monthly installments, complete with illustrations. Think of Dickens and Thackeray, who did his own illustrations, Wilkie Collins, and others. But Jane Eyre was published in its 3-volume format with no serialization. Charlotte chooses in the end not to have that 3rd edition illustrated, and she writes her publisher, "I have not the skill you attribute to me. It is not enough to have the artist's eye. One must also have the artist's hand to turn the first gift to practical account. If then Jane Eyre is ever to be illustrated, it must be by some other hand than that of its author. But I hope no one will be at the trouble to make portraits of my characters. Bulwer and Byron heroes and heroines are very well. They are all of them handsome. But my personages are mostly unattractive in look, and therefore ill-adapted to figure in ideal portraits. At best, I've always thought such representations futile." Many scholars have noted that the reason it was not illustrated until 1872 is because the writing is so descriptive. The landscape, the fashions, the characters, the interiors, they're so well represented in words that accompanying illustrations would only detract from the language, from the story. Henry James, always with an opinion, lambasted the publishing world of Jane Austen with his scorching admonishment, "Publishers, editors, and illustrators offering up anything, whether tasteful or not, into what proves to be saleable form." And why this concern with illustrations interfering with the text led R.W. Chapman, in his 1923 Oxford edition of Austen, to follow the advice of his publishers, who were bitterly opposed to any imaginative illustrations and would cheerfully have no illustrations at all, though they would be in favor of a few objective illustrations. So each volume of this Oxford edition has only contemporary illustrations to enhance the text, not to actually illustrate the story. So as you see here in this fashion plate. James had thoughts on the Brontes as well, admonishing the public in his concern with their confusion of the life and the works and the beginnings of the Brontë myth with the publication of Gaskell's Life of Charlotte Brontë in 1857. And from there, complains James, this life story of the Brontë family supplants their matter, their spirit, their style, their talent, their taste. It embodies really the most complete intellectual muddle. And we can add that much has been written on James's own artistic appropriation of Jane Eyre in his 1898, The Turn of the Screw. This is a Folio Society edition from 2022, but that's another lecture entirely. But couldn't this be Jane Eyre approaching Thornfield in this image? So there were no Jane Eyre illustrations until 1872, and these by Edward Morrison, another Edmund, Morrison Wimperis. But as you can see here, he portrayed only the houses in the story. The first one here at Gateshead. Watercolors based on actual places and landscapes in Bronte's life, reflecting what we readers see as the places on Jane's journey to self-knowledge. There were no other illustrations. Excuse me. So now I'm going to go back to the first question. What would you choose to illustrate? Characters, settings, and scenes. I'm going to go through some of the major scenes in Jane Eyre. In the event you haven't reread it recently, this will be the graphic version of the novel. There are many minor scenes as well, and often portrayed if the illustrator is not limited in number. So we know that there are 5 stages in Jane Eyre's journey. Gateshead, her journey to selfhood, beginning at Gateshead and ending at Ferndean, and with what we might say are the negative and positive forces that challenge and shape her in each place. So we have Gateshead and then Lowood, Thornfield, Moorhouse and Marsh End, and Ferndean. We will go on this journey by showing the variety of illustrators who render some of the most important scene in each place. Again, the book is so visual. There is nary an artist who can replicate what Brontë does with words. And again, each artist brings a very subjective view to the tale. Someone wonders if they've even read the book. But afterwards, I would like you to discuss which illustrator or scenes work the best for you and why. And what would you illustrate that I don't show as having been done? And again, if you've gone to that link of the handout, this is where you'll start to see them listed, and they are listed alphabetically. So I'm mostly going to focus on these. The Edmund Henry Garrett, who I had mentioned above. F.H. Townsend from 1897. He was very early and more traditional. Edmund Dulac, and some of you might know him, he did exotic illustrations of fairy tales. Here is his Bluebird, and Shakespeare. But his first illustrated work was the novels of the Brontës when he was 22 years old. And here he shows Bessie saying goodbye to Jane. Ethel Gabain, 1923, here she's meeting, Jane is meeting Adele for the first time. Gabain was a French-Scottish artist, and her Jane Eyre is a French edition with lithographs. It is notable that she portrays Jane and Rochester as equal throughout the book. Fritz Eichenberg from 1943, and this is my own illustrated edition, and it remains my favorite. More gothic and unnerving, emphasizing the darker aspects of the story. It perhaps inspired the gothic feel of the 1944 film with Orson Welles and Joan Fontaine that came out the following year. It is interesting to read Eichenberg's life story of escaping Nazi Germany and how those fears and memories play out in his illustrations, especially in his Wuthering Heights. Again, the book was sold as a set, Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. Edward Wilson from 1944 for the Illustrated Modern Library. There are 35 tricolor full-page drawings. This modern library series was short-lived, only 24 titles, of which 4 are ghost titles, meaning that they were advertised but never published. I like these illustrations of Wilson's very much, except for the covers, which you see here, have nothing to do with what's inside this beautiful Jane and handsome Rochester. And they are not at all what they look like inside the book. Simon Brett, I like his very much. These are black and white wood engravings from 1991. Jane, we see here reading in her window seat. And Brett, and Susan Allen Ford just brought this up. She thought this was Simon Brett, the actor and author. But Brett notes on his website that the more famous actor playwright, Simon Brett, nipped the simonbrett.com domain, and his work is a lot funnier and more enjoyable than a wood engraver's can ever be, is what he had to say. I think that's very funny. I assume this Simon Brett is quite entertaining, therefore. So now we have Dame Darcy. The famed cartoonist does a fine over-the-top Jane Eyre with black and white and color, with text and full-page illustrations, complete with imaginary dreams and all possible emotional states Jane passes through. I love this edition. Slate calls it Governess Gone Goth. And last, Santiago Caruso. This is the most recent Folio Society. Caruso is an avant-garde symbolist artist from Argentina who specializes in horror, fantasy, and mystery. And he says he was looking for the beauty and light in the darkness of the story of Jane Eyre. But here's an example of his work in Señorita Cristina to give you an idea of how his mind works. So I will throw in others for comparison purposes. There are so many. So this is really just a taste. Notice how many illustrators, mine or others, not plagiarism really, what is called artistic appropriation, or really just a similar reading of a well-described scene. So let's follow Jane on her journey. We're going to start at Gateshead. Again, I love this image. So at Gateshead, where Jane suffers loneliness, oppression, and maltreatment by her relations. There are several illustrations covering a few important scenes. I showed you one already, but of Jane reading. Eichenberg gives us a text illustration only, as you see her up there in the corner. Bernice Oler, and this is a book directed more for children, but she has her in her alcove there, but imagining the very books Jane is reading. And if you remember in Jane Eyre, it's very well described what Jane's reading when she's in that alcove. Barrack, birds, and you see the pictures. So I love this illustration that she covers it. And then Simon Brett, we saw this one above of her reading. And here we have Dame Darcy showing all of Jane's imagination. Then, of course, at Gateshead, we have Jane exiled to the Red Room. And how scary do you make this? M.V. Wheelhouse has a very red room. And Booker, which is also a book more for children, it's not quite as scary as I think it is in the book. Eichenberg with a very frightened Jane, and Wilson in 1944. But how do you make this effective without the color red? Barnett Friedman and Santiago Caruso, very similar images of Jane seeing herself in the mirror. And here is an image I love. It's a very rare one showing Jane actually hitting John Reed. This is from Paul Hogarth in a Czech edition I have. And I love this. John getting his due from our feisty Jane. Or we have Jane with her Aunt Reed. Here we have Townsend and Orr. But one thing I notice in all these images is Jane standing with her feet far apart, defiantly, as you see in this Orr, and you'll notice it in others that I have coming up. There are several images of that black pillar, Mr. Brocklehurst, but either at Gateshead or at Lowood. So we will go there now to see him. And this is the image of Lowood, where Jane suffers starvation and cruelty, but also discovers friendship, kindness, and her own abilities. When Jane first meets Mr. Brocklehurst, we might compare the scene to when Fanny Price first encounters Sir Thomas. Fanny looks frightened, but Sir Thomas is not nearly as fearsome as Mr. Brocklehurst. Some artists have her meeting him at Gateshead. There's Garrett and Wheelhouse. And Orr and Premble have them meeting him at Lowood. And this is a very similar image, but with different techniques. Or Booker, which I love, looks like something out of Dickens. Or Grieg, very traditional, but also look at her feet again. Many illustrators give us a scene of Jane being punished. It's a very visual scene. So here we have Eichenberg and Sewell on the pedestal of infamy, as Brontë calls it. Wilson and Caruso, the same. Caruso has with his punish her body, save her soul. And you see the other students. No one really paying very much attention. Eichenberg and Darcy both show us all the students in rather Gothic straits. Notice in the Eichenberg that it is only Jane who has her eyes opened and observing, as we know she is, and has a Handmaid's Tale sense to it long before Atwood's book. Dame Darcy shows them all freezing and poorly clothed. Helen is either shown with their first meeting or in death. Dame Darcy gives us both. And Gabain and Anthony Colbert, both with lots of empty, lonely space in this wrenching scene. So now we go to Thornfield. Many scenes and characters here, and where Jane discovers love and betrayal. So which to pick for a short talk? We must, of course, have Jane first meeting Rochester, and most illustrators, even those with only a few images, draw this dramatic encounter. But do you focus on Jane or on Rochester? On the horse, or do you include the all-important pilot? And do you have Rochester arriving on the scene or actually falling? Or after the fall when Jane helps him? How would you do this? So if we have him arriving, Garrett has Rochester just riding into the frame. Wilson has Jane on the fence with you awaiting her future as you see Rochester approaching. Caruso has Rochester actually falling, Jane seeming to cast a spell on the horse, which Rochester believes she has done. This unknown artist is quite good. Or Dame Darcy with just a text illustration, but also falling. And these two very similar, Barbara Brown, along with my favorite, Eichenberg, is all action. Or do you illustrate after the fall? Here we have Grieg with Rochester down. This looks like a mess to me. That's what my feeling. And Townsend with Rochester already off the horse, and Jane is taming Messoir, or however you pronounce the horse. Dulac and this Monroe Orr, where we get the facial views of Rochester and Jane, although I think Orr's Rochester looks just like the actor Christopher Walls, again, way before Walls showed up on the scene. Brett, very dramatic, and just the faces are in shadow. And I like this. And Pilot barking. Or Gabain and Wilson, making the hobbling Rochester an old man at 40. However, this image of Rochester down, and I actually think it's similar to the one I think is a mess. I'll go back. Oh, maybe not. No, there it is. It's very similar, but look at this. The first meeting of Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester is a painting by Thomas Davidson. It is not in a book. And it's action inspired. It's quite good. It's he's an English artist who specialized in historic naval scenes, but he donated this to the Brontë Parsonage Museum, where it remains today. If anybody's been there, you've seen it. So at Thornfield, we obviously must give the burning bed a few scenes. So here we have Townsend and Piers. And here's Wilson and Monique Gord. And this is more, again, of sort of a children's edition. And Brett, who I think gets it just right. So we also have life at Thornfield, with images of parties and Miss Ingram and Jane all alone. This wheelhouse and Gabane, and you can see with an isolated Jane looking on in the one on the right. These two images of Rochester and Miss Ingram brings me to the subject of carriages. Carol Mueller, we have, this is the only other one of Miss Ingram and Rochester riding. And Eichenberg with Rochester and Blanche arriving from the perspective of Jane looking on. She's obviously looking out the window and seeing them arriving. Carriages are my favorite thing to study and talk on in Jane Austen. There are not so many in Jane Eyre and lack the meaning that they do in Austen. So here are just two of the many. Hugh Thompson with his penchant for drawing horses whenever given the chance. Here's Emma with Mr. Suckling's carriage. And Philip Goff in Mansfield Park with the all-important barouche heading off to Southerton. But again, in Austen, the carriages all have a meaning. Mr. Suckling's carriage tells us how much money he has. This barouche tells us how much money they have. So a few illustrate the harrowing scene of Mr. Mason with Jane as caretaker. But though I said I would not talk about covers, here is the bleeding Mr. Mason on the cover of this 1967 paperback. I find this a rather bizarre choice, don't you think? The gypsy, this, like Rochester on the horse, is a scene ripe for illustration, and the artists do not disappoint. This is a scene you can actually have fun with, and you'll see how differently they do. So here we have Garrett and Townsend, and here's Orr and Gabane. Friedman, which is very claustrophobic, and Eichenberg, which I love, all the detail of the clothing, the hat, and the furnishings. And then Jane, you can see her just arriving in the back. Wilson and Jenny Thorne from 1975. But then we have Dame Darcy, and probably my favorite, where we have the gypsy actually a cartoon witch. When we have the proposal, where Jane has her feminist rant, do you think because I am poor, obscure, plain, and little, that I am soulless and heartless? You think wrong. It is my spirit that addresses your spirit, just as if both had passed through the grave and we stood at God's feet, equal as we are. So is this a romantic scene or one of impending doom? Garrett, you do not hesitate to take a place at my side, do you? So it's a very tender scene. Wheelhouse and Gabane, it's all in shadow. Eichenberg, where Rochester completely envelopes Jane. And Wilson, these are quite similar, and both with the looming chestnut tree in the background. This rather messy John Hoonengarth from 1954, where we see faces, and where, like in Northanger Abbey, I break all the rules and introduce someone you've never heard of before. And this Hogarth from 1957, I quite like this one, even though Jane appears to be a bit overdressed. Both Dame Darcy and Caruso give us the ominous future destruction of the chestnut tree in the scene. But I like the Darcy because she is seen giving her rant. Well, as we know, all this romantic stuff comes to a swift end. So how do we portray Bertha? We've already seen a few of these, but here again. How did they do her story that Jane now learns? So do we show the tearing of the veil as Townsend and Orr do? And it's very interesting. I don't know if anybody noticed in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, there's a new book out called Salvage, Readings from the Wreck, about Black and brown characters that British colonialism obscured. And Bertha is a perfect example of that. And they use this picture that here on the left by Townsend, but it is unattributed in the New York Times. So I just find that absolutely unacceptable. But anyway, that's the picture. So if you have that New York Times book review, you'll see that. So in Gabain and Wilson, they give us the common theme of Jane and Bertha in the mirror, long before Gilbert and Gabar's theory of Jane Eyre's mirroring Bertha. Or, as shown above, I gave you these already, do we scare Jane to death in this very claustrophobic Eichenberg and Sewell, and also Friedman and Levinson. Dulac has that lunging Bertha that I already showed, and Dame Darcy says it all with just these two text illustrations. Or do we show the interrupted wedding? Garrett and Orr both show those, with Garrett, Rochester about to hit Mason. And then there's Herbert Anderson, another newbie, and Simon Brett, with Bertha nowhere in sight, but the wedding is being interrupted. So we next go to Moor House and the Marsh End, where Jane experiences loss, friendship, family, and the coldness of a not quite human love. We next see Jane on her journey as she leaves Thornfield. And this is a good picture from Dame Darcy. She eventually arrives at the doorstep of the Rivers home, who turns out to be, as you know, her cousin. So it's way too much of a coincidence, but it works for a Victorian novel. So this is portrayed in various ways. She's often shown lost at a crossroads. This is Grieg and Gabain. Or she's seen begging with Townsend. Or again, this one of my favorite images of Jane just all alone in foul weather. Do you show her arriving on the doorstep? So here you have Townsend and Dulac. Eichenberg, I think, gets it just right with an imposing St. John showing up. And Dame Darcy shows not this at all, but the two Rivers sisters with Jane recovering. We do get a rarely, very rarely, illustrated Poor Rosamond here with Jane, St. John, and this is by Garrett. Many portray St. John's proposal. Garrett and Dulac, very traditional. My heart is mute, says Jane. Or shows St. John looking away, ignoring Jane, as does Eichenberg, but much more dramatically. St. John looking to greater things than mere human love. Brett perhaps does it best. He pressed his hand firmer on my head as if he claimed me. My iron shroud contracted around me. St. John's power over her is seemingly absolute. Then we have Rochester's call. Jane, Jane, Jane. Caruso does this beautifully. He writes about his image for the Folio Society. St. John looks to the right, to what is coming, the East or India, with the sun as a masculine ruler. Jane is looking at her past life with Mr. Rochester. She hears his calling through the wind. She's under the symbol of the moon, the feminine symbol of power. The words that Jane wants to hear, the words of love, are coming in the wind through time and space, through pain and darkness. And so I love this image. So then we go to Ferndean, where we have resolution and love. The final part of Jane's journey, after she hears Rochester's call, is portrayed in various ways. It takes her 36 hours. So do you have her, as she returns, do you have her seeing Thornfield in this dramatic scene? I saw a blackened ruin. So here we have Grieg and Eichenberg. And then Brett and Caruso are similar, with the silence of death about it. Or do you have Jane coming upon Rochester unseen, as she does at Ferndean? I stayed my step, almost my breath, and I stood to watch him, to examine him, myself unseen, and alas, to him invisible. So here we have that with Levinson. And another newbie to the talk, Maggie Salcedo, is a French painter. But again, you see Rochester and he cannot see Jane. So the other option is to show Jane secretly entering the room with Rochester, awaiting his tea. Pilot pricking up his ears when I came in. Oops, I'm sorry. I skipped one. Darcy and Eichenberg, this is his last illustration for Jane Eyre, a Rochester groping in his blindness. The feeling is that Jane is off the page, seeing him as he now is. Or do you see her secretly entering the room with Rochester, awaiting his tea? Pilot pricking up his ears when I came in. So here we have Townsend, Wheelhouse, and Gabane, and they're all quite similar. But before we get to our happily ever after, we must learn of the burning of Thornfield and the story of Bertha's death. Various artists have taken this on with different perspectives. Garrett, as Patsy Stoneham notes, portrays Bertha as a kind of transcendent spirit, finally free from her sad and confined life. Townsend, on the right, shows her flattened on the stones to be peered at by domestics. You can just barely see the servants on the right-hand side. Wilson here is perhaps the most dramatic. And a surprise to me that Eichenberg nor Darcy illustrate this scene because it is so dramatic. And so finally, we get to Reader, I Married Him. I shall run through most of the illustrators I have talked about here. All give us something to end with on a more or less happy note. All except Eichenberg, but each portrays it differently. Garrett, here on the left, gives us only this text illustration. He saw nature. He saw books through me. Townsend shows Rochester seeing Jane's dress. Jane, have you a pale blue dress on? Dulac finds them happy walking out together, as does Orr, very similar. And they're way too attractive a couple. We entered the wood and wended homeward. Gabane has the scene. I took that dear hand, held it a moment to my lips, then let it pass round my shoulder. Sewell gives us Jane on a broken Rochester's knee, where she spends, in the book, a good deal of time in conversation. And Pilot is here. Wilson has them happy far afield. And Brett also has the on-the-knee kissing scene with Pilot again, a nice touch. Dame Darcy gives us a wedding, which seems a rather silly way to close this talk. So in a story that gives us a heroine who refuses to accept anything less than being an equal, how can I end this? I could play the hopeless romantic with his favorite Eichenberg of mine. Here, the proposal scene with Jane lovingly embraced by Rochester. But he is, as I've said, controlling and confining her. So I shall end instead with a Santiago Caruso. Jane is slightly above Rochester and now equal to him. Caruso, though his usual genre, as I'd said, is horror and fantasy, he finds love, beauty and magic in Jane Eyre. This is his final image, and the one he says that includes subtle poetry and symbolic elements. Here, the flames of the candles, symbolizing the love that holds steady in the winds of life. Choose then, sir, her who loves you best, says Jane. I will choose her I love best, says Rochester. So, questions. I was going to speak a little more about, but I've gone on. And I want to hear your thoughts and how you would have illustrated the talk, and what illustrators you liked the best, and who you felt conveyed the way you view the book the best.
That was wonderful, Deb. Thank you so much. I feel immersed in this world. Although differently. I love since you asked, I love Eichenberg.
Yes.
And
I didn't say that too often, did I? That he's my favorite.
Well, it's interesting to me because I went and pulled right at the beginning of your talk my 2 modern library editions from my youth. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't remember anything about the Jane Eyre, and it turns out it's because there weren't any illustrations in there. But in The Wuthering Heights, it was Eichenberg's woodcuts. And those haunt my life, especially the one where Kathy is pulling her Lockwood's wrist through the window. So he really gets the darkness of those stories really well. I hadn't seen these Jane Eyre before, but I can see why you love them so much.
Well, and he also in that set did Wuthering Heights, and Wuthering Heights, of course, is even darker, and they're brilliant. The ones for Wuthering Heights, and but it's also one of the first, of an illustrated edition that I had.
I was wondering about that. Yeah.
So I think, it came out in 1943, but just like most people, when you ask what's their favorite Pride and Prejudice movie, it depends on how old you are. The older people love the Laurence Olivier, and those who came on board in the 90s loved, the Colin Firth. And so it's the same. I think of the first one you see stays with you.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that also it has to do with the woodcuts? Because it seems like there's a heaviness and darkness to those. You said that in terms of hassle, but that make them appropriate for these Gothic stories like Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I had always thought that Hassel's, she illustrated all the Austen novels for folio, and that they are definitely more suited to a Brontë. So it's why I had to have that little Brontë scene in there. But she didn't do Jane Eyre. So disappointment. Yeah.
Inga, you're muted.
So much in those illustrations that we could unpack, like that Eichenberg that you really enjoyed, that you called the romantic proposal scene. There was the bench surrounding the oak tree, but also like containing the oak tree, like it was almost like a link in a chain around it. And then that last Caruso that you stopped on, I thought it was so interesting that there were these 2 sort of separate but equal candles. Instead of having the one unity candle, they still remained distinct. And then there was an really ominous looking back shadow of them in the wall that also had her very much on top, like you were saying, but also kind of indicated what couldn't be, you couldn't return to the past before all these tragic events were there. So
I thought he was brilliant in his illustrations, Caruso, and yet you saw what his usual work is, but it worked for Jane Eyre. Yeah. So are there any other questions?
Well, there's one from our viewers has one here. I will say that I haven't seen many illustrations that balance the Gothic elements with the more domestic ones. Seems like they go either one way or the other. What do you think about that? And because it also brings up some interesting ideas about irony.
Well, again, I think some of it is who's the audience for the book. So some of the books that were illustrated more for children, they're gentler. There's no question. But I mean, I got that Eichenberg when I was still a child, probably 12.
And you're scarred.
Exactly.
Scarred for life. But it's so interesting about, and so yes, I lean toward him. I do like the Wilson. And one other thing about the Eichenberg is that his last illustration is that scene of Jane coming upon him with him groping, and he doesn't illustrate at all. They're actually coming together at the end. So yeah, I mean, it depends on who the artist is doing the book for. Some of them in the list that I have, you'll see some of them are definitely were done for children. Like Nell Booker, the OLLI. Yeah, there are a number of them. So did that answer the question? Did you put that up? The Gothic elements?
I mean, it was just meant for commenting. So sure, yeah.
Yeah. So Deb, talking of the some of the strain that we've been talking about between image and text, I was so interested in forgive me, I don't remember who the illustrator is, but the drawing of the children enjoying a piece of Mrs. Weston's. It's so sentimental. And it struck me as being really jarring, in tension with Austen's irony. And I wondered if you might say a little bit more about that.
Well, it's interesting. That was in Thomson's Emma, and that he ended up illustrating. And they're critics of Thomson who says he made it all very comic and fun and light, and you don't get so much the irony that is Jane Austen. He really brings the comedy, and the Brocks brought the fashions, just making it all very pretty. But of course, that I love that sentence about Mr. Woodhouse would never believe it, and he's just drawing that great picture of the kids all stuffing their faces. Yeah, I mean, I like Hugh Thomson, but I do think he probably felt he couldn't have done a Jane Eyre. He did Gaskell, he did Cranford. He really started that school of illustration called the Cranford School, but it's all very sentimental, and so he's a very different illustrator than I think who should do a Jane Eyre. That's why I was disappointed that Hassel didn't, because she would have been great at it. Yeah.
Well, and your framing of it is so interesting, because Emma really is a text about how people are portrayed, or how these relationships are portrayed. I'm thinking of Emma's portrait of Harriet, and all of the confusion. So having these illustrations as another text to lay alongside everything Austen's doing with image, with invention, is so suggestive. And I just imagine that your readers must have had a field day with this.
Absolutely. And, the thing with Austen is she doesn't give the description the way Jane Eyre does. And there's some of the reasoning why she was, Jane Eyre was not illustrated so much in her time, as, the scholar Simon Cook says. But Austen, you could do so much with, because there wasn't the description. So you could create the faces. That's why I love the Jackie Oakley. Her thought, I'm not going to give faces to any of these characters, because immediately you respond to that right away.
So this,
and it's either yes, works for you or doesn't. Yeah.
This, I wanted to, this is Alice's question is related to this. Who gets to pick the illustrator and the publisher? Because there was this lovely thread in the chat about everyone's favorite actors in all of the film adaptations, and who's the better Lizzie Bennet. And so I thought Alice's question here is important because it's about casting. It's about who gets to make these decisions.
Well, in that time, it would be likely that the publisher would have the illustrator in mind. I mean, some of these illustrators illustrated many books, and so they were, sort of a staff almost. And when they choose, like, why didn't somebody choose Hassel to do Brontë? Why did that not happen? Is a question. Today, I mean, most people, if you know anybody who's published like children's books, often the author doesn't get to choose the illustrator or to work with the illustrator they want to have their work illustrated. It's like I mentioned, there's a whole package, and what is this book going to look like? What's the binding? What's the print? What is it illustrated? Who's doing the illustration? So it's a combination of things, and how the publisher worked with,
and finances.
Finances, yes. I was just doing a talk on A Christmas Carol, and of course Dickens, he wanted A Christmas Carol published, unlike all his other works. It wasn't done serially, and and he wanted it illustrated in a certain way. He wanted bound in a certain way, and the publisher said, we're not doing that. So Dickens published it, paid for himself, often the way Austen published. And he knew that if this book had not been a success, he would have probably gone bankrupt. But so he did. He paid all the upfront costs. He had an illustrator that he wanted, this particular illustrator, John Leach, and he had to do it all in 6 weeks. I mean, it's an amazing story of publishing history, A Christmas Carol. And it all worked out. 6,000 copies were printed, and they were all sold out in 5 days. And so there's an example of the author said, I want to do it my way. And the only way he could do it was to actually do it himself. So.
Did you have something, Susan?
Yeah, I was going to ask about the illustrations of Bertha, because I was very fascinated by that. How monstrous should she be? Sometimes she actually looks like a monster. Sometimes she looks like a ghost, a ghostly figure. She's very indefinite. What can you say about that, the range, and what you think about it?
Well, that's why I tried to show the range, because it is how the author and the illustrator are interpreting. So if the book is given to somebody, obviously it's, long after Brontë is gone, so she has no say. As I said, she didn't want an illustration. She didn't think her characters were attractive enough to be illustrated. But she, Bertha is an interesting case. And so obviously if you're having it's a book for the audience's children, it's going to not be as horrifying. And again, it's how do you view Bertha? We all have different views. Modern scholarship is very, and here was this new book out that I just mentioned in the talk. Here's the review right there, and you can see that picture, the Townsend picture, and they don't give him any credit. So I was horrified. So yes, how do you feel about Bertha when you read the book? So if you're reading it and you see an image of Bertha that doesn't agree with what you're thinking in your head, that was one of my questions. Does that ruin the book for you?
Yeah, I mean, some of them really do look like a monster out of Frankenstein or something like that, which, I mean, for me, that's not going to work. And I mean, I wonder too, how many of those are sort of pre-Mad Woman in the Attic, you know, and how the Bertha illustrations might have changed since.
And the role of race in them, yeah.
Mhm,
Yeah. And that's
Yeah.
why the one that I showed that Barnett Friedman did was 1942, and where Bertha is right behind her. It's very claustrophobic. It's very scary.
Mhm.
But again, there was some of that Mad Woman in the Attic effect of the image long before that became, a scholarly view. So people were just getting that themselves, the mirroring. That was before anybody wrote about Bertha and Jane being a mirrored, personality.
Well,
sorry,
yeah.
Susan.
I'm thinking about, I mean, some of those where she's just like a physical grotesque. And actually that sort of responds to Rochester's view of her. I mean, he's so disgusted by her physically.
Yes.
Rather than who she was when she was this kind of exotic woman that lured him in sexually, I mean, how much of that should there still be? It's just that he's changed in terms of how he thinks of her.
But again,
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I'll question the interpretation of that passage from Brontë herself. I wonder if instead of saying that her characters aren't attractive enough to warrant illustration, she's saying, please don't prettify my characters, through your illustrations. No illustrator is going to understand the way I want them, iconoclastically kind of presented. So how attractiveness seems to be a really important issue here also with, at what point does Rochester find her attractive? What point does she overcome his monstrosity, and find him attractive? And it's so pervades the novel.
You're right. I mean, beauty is one of the main themes, I think, in Jane Eyre. It's referred to all the time. And so again, if you have an illustrator and they have their view of the book, that's why each of us, when we're reading, we become an illustrator. We picture these, the story. And that's why I think one of the biggest questions is a book, the one you're reading, is it ruined for you if the artist has created an image that, whoa, this is just not. But I do think in some of the more traditional, where you don't see Bertha at all, you don't really see her. There's a veil over her face, I think that's the artist not wanting to make something, visible that isn't really, you don't want it to be visible. Right. You want your imagination to play. So what are you as the reader thinking and seeing when you're reading these passages about her? Yeah.
When it really dramatizes the way that the judgment of the reader gets mixed up with the judgment of the narrator and the judgment of right. And all of these things are sort of amplifying and refracting one another. And it strikes me that the illustrator is almost, in a sense, a kind of like narrator, like sort of vying for some kind of voice about, who these people are. And to the degree that we're meant to understand external feature as some sign of human depth, right?
Yeah.
It really abilities for interpretation.
Well, it's why I like the Eichenberg so much, because so many of his images are of Jane, and because it's a first person narration, so many of the illustrations are her seeing things. It's her seeing Rochester. It's her seeing them come into the house, you know,
Right.
Blanche and Rochester. So it's like she's always right there to the side. And so that's his perception. And that's why I think they work so well.
Mhm.
I mean, that works in Jane Eyre because it's not a very ironic book. You know,
No.
we're not meant to criticize her point of view, generally speaking, you know,
Mm.
maybe when she's a child, but Austen, you know, it doesn't work quite the same way because you have to be able to be both in and outside
Yes.
the characters.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We have a question from Tracy, who is wondering how many artists have tried to replicate Jane's drawings that Rochester so admires. I think you showed Dame Darcy doing that.
Yeah. What did you think of Dame Darcy?
I've never heard of her before.
Well, she's a cartoonist. She's very well known, but she took on Jane Eyre. So there are a few. There is the Dame Darcy was the one that I showed. I'm trying to think right now of others. I think that Bernice Oler, who did the one of Jane reading, and you see the images of the books she's reading. I think she does it. And of course, those drawings, they're biblical and, you know, mythological. So you could do so much with them. They're so visual again. But that's an example of that would have been something you would have expected Brontë have said, oh, sure, I'll do those. Because she's created the drawing in the writing.
But then you almost really don't need them because she creates it. You know what it looks
you were
like.
saying.
Yeah.
But you know, it's also,
go ahead.
It's also, I mean, that you brought up that Thomas Bewick, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Bewick, British History of Birds, I think, or History of British Birds. And that book was so famous for its illustrations, right? But in that one, he illustrates all kinds of crazy things because the book is really about his illustrations. And so it's not just birds, but village life and you know, cows and things, ships. I guess she talks about that. So what do you make? I mean, what's she doing with that book? Because it seems to play an inordinate role and his use of illustrations himself.
Well, I made a list. I have it here somewhere of all the books that is mentioned that Jane Eyre actually reads. It's a fascinating list because there's obviously a lot, and there's so many biblical references. But there are a lot of other references. But those books that she's reading as a child are. I wish I had it in front of me, but of course I don't. But again, it comes back to the issue of what has been said of why did so few illustrators illustrate her in her own time, you know, until the 1890s, really, there wasn't anybody. And it's because it is so descriptive. You almost don't want it illustrated in some ways. So
I loved Caruso, especially where she's standing on the stool of shame. I mean,
that was powerful.
It just takes you into this other sort of nightmare world. It's really wonderful.
I think he captures it so well, and I love that image of her and all the other, you know, students. They're all reading or doing their own thing. They're not paying any attention to her, which just adds, you know, to that isolation, that aloneness.
Yeah, but also because they're afraid, right?
They're afraid.
I mean, your comparison to The Handmaid's Tale at another point, I think, was really apt. I mean, you get a sense in those illustrations of just the frightening nature of that world that she's in.
Well, we're so excited to talk about. Sorry, we're so excited to talk about this that we could go on and on. I think I'd like to talk another hour on this, but I think we're out of time, aren't we, Susan? I think we.
Yeah, I'm afraid so.
So thank you very, very much, Deb, and everyone in the audience too for your questions and comments. Please stay around for a couple more minutes while we share some more news from Jane Austen and Company. I'm going to turn things over to Sarah.
So our next event will take place on December 3rd, when we'll hear from Dr. Maria Frawley. We have been very proud of our ability to maintain a pay what you can format for these events, because we recognize that not everyone may be in a financial position to pay to attend. If you are able, however, please consider supporting our programming by donating either on our website or through the link we are sharing right now. It really makes a very big difference. We want to keep Jane Austen and Company as widely available as possible, and donations are how we are able to do that. Even a few dollars can help make a big difference. So thank you for your continued support.
And just a reminder, the recording of tonight's presentation is going to be posted to our website, janeaustenandco.org, and to YouTube very soon after we finish tonight. And if you can't wait till our next event on December 3rd, you can view any of our previous programs on the website, which contains an archive of all our previous lectures. There are more than 40, on topics ranging from Jane Austen's daily musical practice and music books to the work of Regency textile designer Anna Maria Garthwaite, to multicultural adaptations of Jane Austen novels. We've really enjoyed bringing you this thought-provoking programming for the last 3 years.
And I also just want to mention, since we missed it in the beginning, Nadea, can you share the Jane Austen Collaborative site?
Oh, yeah, the screen.
I am also this is posting the website. It's just janeaustencollaborative.org if you want to look at that yourself. I think Nadea has the site here. This is what the homepage looks like, but it describes our various ventures, including the Jane Austen and Co. that you are familiar with. All right.
Nice.
Well, thank you everybody so much. Thank you, Deb, for really
Deb, that was lovely.
Thank you. You saved the chat?
Absolutely.